I talk a lot, and I get a lot of shit for talking a lot about how much of politics is psychological. Psychological is kind of a bullshit word, right? You could almost say spiritual. But for the purposes of this exercise and just to exist in the kind of secular atheist framework, I'll say psychological. Even deeper, more disturbing, and definitely more black pilling is the idea that many political beliefs could actually be sexual, or what the Freudians would call psychosexual. This is not a very nice thing to think. That my political orientation, values, belief system, the kind of society that I think I want to live in may actually be informed by some kind of darker undercurrent. But you can see it very clearly in the chud. You can see it very clearly in the incel who wants to institute a Christian, fascist, white nationalist, ethno-state government because they want a state-mandated girlfriend. It's a horrible thought. It's a horrible thought to think, and it's an even more horrible thought to think about yourself. But one has to be critical. One has to be introspective. And if we want to actually look at it, we should take our wants and our desires, politically speaking, to the logical conclusion. Like, we should run back the clock. We should look at societies where that's actually happened, because the past is replete with them. If we look at the highly austere, highly ascetic, highly militarized society of ancient Sparta, where the pursuit of perfection is not metaphorical but biological, we have a really clear-cut example of a society that has prioritized selective breeding in the past. We have a society that, whilst it was once great, does sort of seem like the cooked-up fevered dream of a couple of online chuds. When you actually look into Sparta and how their society functioned, it's ruthlessly chudded to its very core. But of course, in many ways it worked. The Spartans believed in the training of the body and the training of the spirit, but they also believed in the training of society as like a living organism. That over time you could mold and bend the fabric of the population to suit your state-enforced aims. This is long before Darwin. This is long before Galton. This is long before the myriad shitshow incomprehensible horrors of the 20th century that ruined the word eugenics for everybody, frankly. Right? But the Spartans were running a full-blown eugenic program, top to bottom, throughout their whole society, based on selective breeding, based on infanticide, quite frankly, based on a brutal meritocracy, if you like, of the flesh. The Spartan regime was one where the body was actually a political statement, where weakness could actually be perceived as treason, if you like. And this begins in the cradle. Actually, if we want to be really specific about it, this begins before the cradle. This begins in the womb. Spartan infants are inspected at birth, not by their parents, the Western Anglo-liberal mind boggles, but by a council of elders, by a high council of elders who would check them and examine them for like deformity or frailty or unfitness, hold the newborn up by his ankle while he wails, and kind of inspect him in the light of the sun to see if he looks like, if he meets the standards of the group. And if he doesn't meet the standards of the group, well, Plutarch writes about this. Plutarch talks about this. We have a very enduring and very vivid account from Plutarch. Quote, offspring were not reared at the will of the father. The elders of the tribes officially examined the infant, and if it was well built and if it was sturdy, they ordered the father to rear it. They ordered the father to rear it. But if it was ill-born, if it was deformed, they sent it to the so-called apothetai, a chasm-like place at the foot of Mount Taygetus. That's from the Life of Lycurgus, Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus. You got to consider the state you say you want, a highly militarized theocratic state with a council of based elders, do you want them telling you whether or not you can rear your own child from birth? It gets better, it gets weirder for sure. Infants in ancient Sparta used to be bathed in wine, which was part of a bizarre ritual designed to test their constitution. The basic idea is that you drown the child, right, from fucking up to his neck in extremely strong, pungent, potent wine. And if he starts convulsing or fucking passes out, kicks the bucket, reacts poorly in any way, this can be marked as a sign of weakness. It wasn't a particularly rare ritual. It was actually a very common occurrence that entire batches of children would be bathed in wine, right, regularly in order to test their constitution. The Spartan mother is a really interesting archetype. She doesn't coddle the kids. She doesn't swaddle the kids, right? She doesn't helicopter parents. She bears warriors, or she buries them. Now, not all historians accept Plutarch's version of events. Not all historians take his account at face value. But suffice to say, there is a lot of archaeological evidence of there being bodies at the foot of Mount Taygetus. Like, there are a lot of bodies there. Typically, we're finding adolescent remains. We're not finding baby remains. But of course, baby remains tend to get devoured by nearby wildlife, and it's very difficult to examine the skeletons of people who were tossed into a fucking ravine thousands of years ago in order to find out to what extent we are looking at state-enforced infanticide. But this is repeated enough in the ancient sources and taken seriously enough by the ancient historians that I think we can accept that this was Spartan practice. If not literally in fact, then definitely in spirit. We can assume that one or two babies, at least, at a minimum, got tossed in there. And this applies to kind of everything else about Spartan society. This applies to reproduction, which they saw much more as a civic duty. And to marriage, which they saw as much more of kind of animal husbandry between humans. The entire Spartan marriage custom centers around the same eugenic logic, unlike in Athens or in Rome, where marriage is a private and political matter tangled up between familias, different familias. Typically it's a civic act in some instances, it's a state act in some instances, but it's often to do with political alliance. In Sparta, reproduction is a civic eugenic act, and marriage too. Right? Men were actually discouraged from marrying too young in Sparta. Similarly, right? Because, I guess they thought it would produce a weaker heir if a guy had a baby younger. Similarly, older men who were past the point of being able to produce good, strong heirs, guys in their 40s and in their 50s who, would kind of farm out the job of reproduction to a younger man. Sometimes they would get a younger man in to kind of bonk the wife, and they would raise the other men's kids, and there was no cuck shame kind of thing, because it was not only socially accepted, it was socially encouraged, because Sparta needed more children, and because the strongest children would come from those men mating with those women. The 60-year-old guy with the 30-year-old wife, she can still have kids. He's not going to be the best sperm donor. Eugenically speaking, then, in a state-mandated sense, then, do we all just lean into sperm? Now, listen up, incels. When you say you want a state-mandated GF, what are you really asking for? Are you really ready for the things that come with that? Are you okay for your state-mandated GF to be the wife of some older dude? Just be very careful, all right, when you're talking about this based eugenic society that you want. State-sponsored breeding is a fascinating idea, right? Again, we can look to Plutarch for a source on this. I have a very interesting quote here. I am quoting now. If an older man had a younger wife and could not have children with her, it was common that he might introduce a younger man of whom he approved to beget those children with her. So it's in the sources. It's not like I'm pulling the shit out of my arse. The Spartan women, too, allegedly, were bred for their strength. They exercised, they trained, they were required by the state to produce robust sons. So it was required that they be in physically peak fit condition at all times. There is obviously this Frank Miller Hollywood meme of like, come back with your shield or come back on your shield, which probably comes, I believe, from the movie 300. I don't know. But this is entirely true from what we can gather looking at the ancient texts of what Spartan women were actually like. Unlike other Greek cities, where the priority seems to have been freedom, right, in some respects, everybody was committed to the state. That's not to say that Spartan women didn't enjoy kind of unusual freedoms, because they did, but they weren't granted to them out of like some sort of enlightenment. They were given to them out of utility. Right? Spartan women, for example, were not honored for their chastity. Spartan women were not honored for being pure, for being virgins. They were honored for how many sons they could produce, for how many warriors they could like create as a kind of warrior sausage factory for warriors. Their wombs did not belong to them. Their wombs were very much instruments of the state. More Plutarch here, I'm quoting now. The custom was to capture women for marriage. I'll repeat it for you. Pull it up. Plutarch speaking now. The custom was to capture women for marriage. The bride's head was shaved, and she was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. The bride's head was shaved, and she was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. Left in the dark, the groom would come in secret, in secret to consummate the marriage. Again, all of this is Plutarch, all of this in the life of Lycurgus. You could read it for yourself. In essence, what I'm saying is even the sex itself on the wedding night, it's not just that the state shacked you up with a woman based on eugenics. It's not just that the state took your kid the moment it was born and inspected it for deformities. It's that even the wedding night consummation sex itself in ancient Sparta was a kind of ritualized, optimized process, completely stripped of love and romance and meaning as we might understand it. Reproduction is not private in ancient Sparta. It's very much the business and the affair of the state. Because reproduction, the Spartans understood quite plainly, is warfare. Reproduction is warfare by other means. If you want to be engaged in a constant, endless war, you're going to need to outbreed your enemy, which means you're going to need to outfuck your enemy, and you're going to need to outfight your enemy, which you're going to need to breed selectively for the strongest warriors. Is this the society that the incels want when they said they want their state-mandated GF? You have to consider the concept of the agoge, the institutionalized idea of the survival of the fittest. Very Warhammer 40k. And it's something we cannot even fathom with our modern, wet, secular, post-Christian education systems of everybody gets a participation award, right? But the education in Sparta was brutal. It was an induction into a system where basically in every way they were looking to cull you before you could reach manhood. That's what the agoge is all about. It's about the state running a brutal education / military training program that starts at age 7 for young boys. It's schooling and conditioning in a really I've talked about this in previous videos, how they required the young men to steal, to shoplift on purpose, just so they could catch them, just so they could beat them. Not for shoplifting, but for being caught. Right? They were trying to train obedience, train endurance, train a resistance, quite frankly, to cruelty and to violence from an extremely young age. They were beating them into being these just unbelievably skilled and fearless warriors. But of course, in order to do this, you got to underfeed them, you got to encourage them to steal, you got to encourage them to fight and beat each other and steal from each other, and you got to ruthlessly punish ineptitude. You've got to cull them out. So, Plutarch talks about how even if they would be hungry or even if they were cold, they would be required to just stand for inordinate amounts of time out front of the temple to Artemis and they would be whipped publicly. They would be, discouraged from joining every day. In Fight Club, that scene where the guys have to stand outside the front of the house, and every day Brad Pitt comes out and tells them, like, you're a worthless piece of shit, go away, go home, but they stay there anyway. That's the kind of shit we're talking about. Day or night, rain or shine, like, they are just going to stand there and get flogged until the agoge accepts them in and trains them fully to become like a man. There's an awful amount of racism in the Spartan statecraft, but not as we understand it. We're talking about racism to any outsider who's not a Spartan. Racism even towards people who are Spartans but are helots, are slaves, right? The whole point of Spartan society is to keep down and keep suppressed this underclass of slaves. How can 300 well-armed, well-trained men suppress inside their own city walls an army, basically, of thousands of slaves? This is how you do it. You do it through ruthless eugenics. You do it with the fact that they are 2 times bigger than the average slave, 2 times stronger, and 1,000,000 times better trained. It all comes down to a kind of innate racism, really, in it. But it's not driven by like metaphorical dreams of a utopia. It's not driven by like pseudo-scientific theories like the racism of the 20th century. It's a pragmatic, cold, martial, political, right, like racism, with a goal to create a genetically superior and culturally homogenous elite caste of warriors able to suppress the numerous helots below them. Xenophon, who was a big-time admirer of Sparta, talks about this, quote, Lycurgus thought that as the progeny of noble animals must be reared with care, so must the best of the human being. Lycurgus there being the founder, the originator, the founding father, if you like, of Sparta and of these Spartan ideals. The idea that just as you must create progenies of animals from noble lines, so must you do that for people. Now, interestingly enough, this is, I guess, where if I was a chudded incel who really wanted such a society, I would be looking at this as something of a warning story. Society for the Spartans declines and crumbles and fractures, and they lose to other city-states like Athens, right? Because of their purity, actually. Over time, the short-term effects are obviously incredible. But the long-term, super long-term, multiple generations effects of the Spartan eugenics programs were actually catastrophic for the Spartan people. So if you look in the sort of early 5th century BC, you've got roughly 9,000 Spartan citizens. And by the time you get to Aristotle, in the kind of 4th century, you've got fewer than 1,000. They failed to actually heed Lycurgus's laws. They began to hoard wealth, and they got very greedy and lazy and few in number because of purity, because of spiraling inwards and kind of nobody being good enough, right? Until the point where there was just simply not enough Spartans to run their own society, right? Let alone to, again, you have to expand. In order for that to work, you have to be expanding outwards. You have to be capturing new women and shaving their heads and inducting them into Spartan, right? The rigid system that produced warriors also pruned its population down to fragility and ultimately into total collapse. You have a citizen class that can no longer sustain itself. Too few children end up being born. Too many young men die in the agoge, die in wars. The Spartan obsession with purity actually meant that the elders ended up deeming very few people worthy of reproduction. By the time you get to the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, this is where Sparta lost to Thebes. Their entire aura of being this invincible, militarized, highly ordered civilization that couldn't be destroyed was shattered. They didn't have any reinforcements left, and with them at that battle dies the kind of myth. Consumed by, if you think about it, the people who believed in it. Sparta did achieve martial greatness through brutal state-directed eugenics. It created warriors, undeniably, but at the cost of flexibility, at the cost of compassion, at the cost of demographic viability, which is always something to consider, right? And it kind of stands as a paradox. It's a culture of unmatched discipline that collapsed under its own weight, under the weight of its own success, which I think we can learn a lot from.